Okay, so the Renaissance starts with the fall of Rome. And what happened was is Rome was really getting just into a massive, massive empire. It was originally formed as a republic, but eventually it turned into an empire where it was just basically encapsulating the entire civilized world at the time, or the majority of the entire civilized world at the time. And it got so big that there was a kind of a split between different sides of Rome. You have the western side of Rome, and you have the eastern side of Rome. And the fall of Rome is basically what we mean when we talk about that is the western fall of Rome. And so whenever Rome fell, it kind of like decayed into this type of medieval Europe, these so-called Dark Ages. And we could get into what exactly the Dark Ages meant, because it's not exactly as dark of an age as what you would think. But what happened on the other side of the East is the East actually goes into the Byzantine Empire, and that survives for another 1,000 years. And so what happens is because that Western side had this total loss of government, and there was no longer a big monarchy, just through there was a loss of the language of Greek. Most of the people couldn't read Greek anymore. They didn't have this big overarching governmental structure to govern everything. They kind of descended into this feudal system, the system with castles and landlords, and that's basically the essence of medieval Europe is the feudal system. Now, over in the East, they're still having this empire, this monarchy, this kingdom. The Byzantine Empire is thriving. They're able to preserve a lot more of antiquity. They're able to preserve a lot more of these ancient ideas. But basically, in the feudal system in the medieval Europe, they're not able to preserve governmental structure on a large scale. So it's basically bare bones, what works for this particular person, this particular area, and then so on and so forth spread out throughout the land. So there's a lot more smaller governmental systems, and it's all basically run by these, maybe smaller king type peoples, but it's nothing like a large scale monarchy, nothing like that at all. But one of the things that they do maintain is this idea of nobility through lineage. And so basically the nobles at the time in the medieval Renaissance, they had this idea that there was some sort of God-given right to them to own the land, and that was really passed down. And it wasn't like you had the land because your ancestors were necessarily smarter or able to manage the land better. It was just because you were born through the bloodline. And so you're really expected to kind of stay in your own particular class. If you were born a peasant, you were expected to die a peasant. If you were born into nobility, you were expected to die nobility. And that was passed down through basically all of the Dark Ages. And so this idea of nobility through lineage really stifled the growth of all of these ideas and value that the peasants could potentially contribute to society were not necessarily allowed. Like you weren't really allowed to do something. Like, for example, there were even certain fabrics or certain types of qualities of materials that the peasants weren't even allowed to own because they were viewed as lesser people. And because of that, they just weren't able to really contribute to society because they were artificially held back. And basically they fell into just a general illiteracy. Like the majority of people couldn't read. And so the poor people had no access to information. They couldn't learn any new things. And so that was another thing that was really holding them back. The only thing that was really preserving all the literacy in the West was the church. And they didn't really preserve a lot of secular ideas. The majority of the ideas that they preserved were basically centered all around the Catholic Church and the teachings of Christianity. And so all of the texts that survived were basically Christian texts. Monasteries have their little libraries, things like that, where they could only preserve that type of knowledge. And all of the secular knowledge, all of the knowledge from ancient Rome, all the knowledge from ancient Greece, that was all considered paganism, irrelevant. And so they kind of just discarded all of that. The only people who were able to read were the monks, and the only information they felt like recording down, it was very expensive and time consuming to copy manuscripts and write things down and to preserve writings. And so they didn't record much history at this time in the West. And that's one of the reasons why they're called the Dark Ages, is just because not a whole lot was written about that time, because most people weren't writing down new things. They weren't really recording what was happening in history. But the thing is they were still building amazing and beautiful things. I mean, if you look at the architecture that was built, this is the golden age of Gothic architecture. So all throughout this time of these so-called Dark Ages, you see some of the most magnificent structures ever built. It's really, I mean, if you look at the Gothic cathedrals and the little medieval villages, they're just so amazing and so beautiful. And this is there was a communal effort to build these, but the difference is that between this and what was happening before and what was happened afterwards is the church basically got to dictate the entire architectural structure, all of the knowledge that was preserved, and you basically, if it was outside of the church, it really wasn't allowed. One of the ideas that really did stick through all of this downfall of civilization was the idea of the transcendentals. And this is basically the idea of goodness, truth, and beauty being transcendent concepts that that go beyond time and space, that are valuable to us indefinitely. These ideas were, the three transcendentals are goodness, truth, and beauty. Goodness basically means virtue, truth basically meant knowledge, and beauty meant harmony. And this was an idea that came from ancient Greece and that was talked about in ancient Rome. But they had a lot more secular approach and secular application to this. In the Dark Ages, they did not have the secular application to this. In the Dark Ages, they valued theology much more over philosophy. And so all of this idea of the transcendentals, the goodness and the truth and the beauty, they believed that there was an objective quality to all of this. This was not a subjective worldview that basically anybody had. Throughout all of art history, you could look at all of the artists, and all the way up until the modern age, artists were striving to achieve the highest level of objective beauty that they possibly could. Now you see a lot of the artistic world where we're striving to deconstruct and redefine beauty. This was not the case for the majority of human history. And so this goes back to ancient Greece and goes back to ancient Rome and even goes back to ancient Egypt and civilizations far before that, ancient Mesopotamia. But Plato and the ancient Greek philosophy really was the main person who like concretized these ideas and wrote them down in a way that we still use today. But this is going to come up over and over and over again throughout these ideas, is this idea of the transcendence, the transcendentals, and how valuable they are in our lives, of acknowledging that there is actually an objectiveness, an objective quality, and that everything is not subjective. Beauty is not necessarily in the eye of the beholder, that there's a harmony and there's an overarching system and structure that the universe is governed by, that all of nature adheres to. And by learning more about that, it increases the quality of everything you do. So that's basically a summary of what happened in the Dark Ages. And then, so over in the East, you have this empire that's still kind of going, and they have all these Greek philosophers that are still able to preserve their knowledge because society hasn't totally collapsed. Until about 1,000 years later. In the 1400s, Constantinople fell, and then you see all of these Greek scholars, they start migrating back over to the West during the fall of Constantinople. So they get to bring all of these Greek ideas, all of these forgotten philosophical ideas, these secular applications to all these principles, and they start to bring that back over to the West. And this coincides right about the same time as the printing press. And I see the printing press as a really interesting parallel to the internet today, because with the printing press, you have insane access to information, unprecedented access to information. This is the same thing that happened with whether it's the internet or the printing press. You have access to information on a scale that you've never seen before. And so you're able to spread ideas and you're able to transfer ideas from one person to the other in a way that you just weren't able to do. And so whenever you have these people bringing these ideas back over from the East to the West, and then you have the printing press where you're able to spread that out, we now have this new access to antiquity. And so all of this culminates in this little city in Italy called Florence. Florence is basically the birthplace of the Renaissance. All of these Greek scholars, most of them ended up in Florence, and Florence became one of the first republics in this feudal system, where the feudal system starts to collapse. You start to see the rise of the merchant class. People are able to gather all these ideas. They're able to build up their own personal libraries. And people who are once born into peasantry are now able to have trade. They're able to have new road systems. They're able to have new access to information, new access to goods from the East. And they're also able to trade their personal goods with the East. There's this insane value transfer, knowledge transfer that's happening from the East to the West, back and forth. And Florence is the heart of all of this. So how is this all relevant to America? Is Florence has so much of a connection to America that most people aren't really even aware of. Like, for example, Amerigo Vespucci. He was a Florentine. America was actually named after a Florentine. And the Florentine society, the Republic of Florence, was built off of the ancient Republic of Rome. This is the same way that America was built off of the ancient Republic of Rome. And so a lot of these ideas that are happening in Florence are very similar to the ideas that are happening in America. This idea that with the George Washington, for example, he was tired of paying rent to his landlords, and there was a lot of other things too, but they were tired of this system of the king, and you had to all be subservient to the king just based off of his lineage. And they said, hey, look, there's ideas that are valuable that transcend your particular bloodline, and that you should have freedom based off of humanity, based off of your own personal humanity, your freedom shouldn't just be based off of your social status. And so Florence really was the freest place in the world at the time. The same way whenever America was established, that was the freest place in the world at the time. So both of these centers of freedom are pivotal in the start of a new age. And we've forgotten so much about this ancient past. We have so much to learn about our past. This is something that the Florentines found extremely valuable. This was basically the revival of antiquity. The revival of classical antiquity was the most important thing to the Florentines, because they said, we can't properly build a new nation. We could have a bunch of theories and ideas about how to do this, but rather than start from scratch, let's go back to history and figure out what worked and what didn't. Let's work to get rid of the things that didn't and keep them out, and to incorporate the things that did. And so this is basically the heart of the Renaissance. And so there we have a little bit of an overview of what happened leading up to the Renaissance, and basically why it was such a big deal, and why it was such a massive change, and why everybody who wanted to break out of this peasantry, wanted to break out of this system where they were constantly being held back and limited just based off of a class that they were born into, a social status they were born into. Now they had this opportunity to go to this land and achieve some sort of Florentine dream, similar to how people from all over the world want to come to America and live the American dream. And we'll end this section with a quote from Leonardo da Vinci about Florence. Leonardo da Vinci says, "In Florence, the mind is free to soar, for her workshops and patrons nurture art and invention as no other city can, making her the heart of this new age." And I think that really summarizes the idea of America and its start, how in America, your mind was free to soar. And it was the heart of a new age. And it nurtured a civilization, and it nurtured a mindset and a possibility that no other place in the world could at the time. And so there's so much that we could learn from ancient Florence and from Renaissance Florence, and tie that into what we're doing here in America, not just as a large scale, but like I said many times, into our individual lives. That will be incredibly valuable, that I've personally incorporated, and it's increased the value of my life and the quality of my life so drastically. I've thought about this so much that I feel like it's now the time where we need to start talking about these ideas, because we can't just forget them. We can't just discard with all of them and just rely on all these modern theories, because one thing that's very clear to me is we're not going in a direction that the general population finds agreeable. It's not normal for the average person to have struggle paying their bills and to struggle paying their rent and to provide food for their family. There's people who are working really hard, and it's not like they're not able to provide through laziness. There's some sort of missing part. Like, what is that missing part? Why is it that so many of Americans are suffering? This is supposed to be the greatest country in the world, in the history of the world, but yet so much of its population is suffering. So there's a missing part. And I really truly believe that it's the ideas, the timeless ideas from ancient antiquity and from the Renaissance that we're so disconnected from, that we're not even familiar with them. We haven't even really talked about them. And so how can we apply something that we don't even know about? So this is what we're going to get into next, is what are these 10 ideas? What do they look like when they're actually played out? And how do we apply them?